Thank you, Emily, and it's good to see all of you virtually this morning. I'm glad you're able to join us for this virtual access event focused on a proposed tax on jobs in Seattle. First off, again, we just hope that you and your friends and family are staying safe and healthy through this challenging period. And we offer our gratitude and thanks to the healthcare workers and folks on the front lines that are doing everything they can to keep us safe. The economic impacts of the coronavirus nationally and locally have just been staggering. The numbers out this morning nationally on unemployment have topped 20 million folks out of work. In Washington state, we're seeing 10 times the number of people out of work compared to the Great Recession. And in downtown Seattle, we've continued to track the economic impacts and are issuing a summary report each day by our research team. And those impacts to hotels, restaurants, retails, nonprofits, the arts and cultural sector have been severe and run deep. And it's within that context that the City Council is considering a new tax on jobs, and is why we've assembled a panel today to dig into that, the content of the tax, how it has been structured, the implications to small, medium, large business and nonprofits in our community, and the political environment, and how you can help express your voice in opposition to this fast-moving legislative proposal. Joining us today, I'll introduce our three panelists, and then we will start with Jack McCullough. Jack is a partner with McCullough Hill Leary, practicing land use law for nearly 40 years in the city of Seattle. He's a member of the board of the Downtown Seattle Association and chairs the DSA's policy committee, which has dug into this proposal. Tim Cease is a partner with CBE Strategic and a member of the coalition that has come together to oppose this measure. Tim will cover the political landscape here in Seattle around the jobs tax and some of the ways in which individuals, small business owners, leaders of nonprofits, and others in our community can engage in this and express their voice. Taylor Wong is the founding executive director of the Ethnic Business Coalition, a small business owner in our community, and a member of the Mayor's Small Business Advisory Task Force. Taylor will share some of her concerns as a small business in Seattle regarding the payroll tax that's been proposed. So let's start with Jack. Jack, the policy committee that you lead has dug into this legislation, the spending plan, how it's structured, what it would do, and also the unique context that we're in legislatively with being in a state of emergency and how that plays with and it impacts how this may or may not move through the council. Can you speak to just the structure and the contents of the tax and what the policy committee at DSA has looked at?
Sure, John, thanks very much, and glad to be here today and welcome all of you. It's April, but ironically, it feels a little like February 2nd, like Groundhog Day again. We've seen this before. A couple of years ago in 2018, and now this job tax 2.0 has returned, only 10 times bigger than we saw before. The legislation that's currently in front of council has three parts to it, and I'll just briefly run over each one and talk a little bit about some of the what we see as the issues on the surface of this. The first is just the ordinance that's going to impose the tax itself. It's a tax on payroll expenses of 1.3%. All compensation paid for any business in Seattle, any employees in any business in Seattle, unless you're specifically exempt. One of the exemptions is for businesses that have payroll expenses less than $7 million a year. Now, it's kind of interesting, it's not been widely reported, but when you look at the ordinance, you say, well, what counts within that $7 million? And the ordinance covers all compensation to employees, quote, primarily assigned within Seattle, or who perform 50% or more of their work in Seattle, or who live in Seattle even if they work somewhere else. So one of the interesting facets of this legislation, I think, is that it's really not just a tax on jobs in Seattle. It's really a tax that is going to have regional and, in some respects, national application. Anyone who is assigned to Seattle or who does 50% of or more of their work here even if they live in Bellevue, even if they live in San Francisco, wherever they live, the city is going to try to get into their pocketbooks and peel this 1.3% out, at least at the company, at the business level. I think that raises some interesting legal questions as to what the extent of the city's authority to impose a tax when actually the incidence of the tax is going to be falling, I think, in significant part on businesses who aren't even domiciled here in Seattle. And there's been a lot of focus on the number of businesses here, the 800 businesses that call Seattle home will be affected, but I think actually the number is going to be vastly larger than 800. And that's something that's going to have to play out. The payroll expense is based on the last prior calendar year, so it's not current year's expenses, and we'll talk about that in a second because obviously that has huge inequities associated with imposing a tax on revenues that were collected in or compensation paid in 2019 in view of the current circumstance in which we find ourselves. It's also a series of other businesses that are exempt. Grocery business is exempt. Nonprofits, most of them are exempt, including the DSA and the Chamber. And then there are a number of businesses that for which state law provides an exemption, or federal law, insurance businesses, businesses that sell motor vehicle fuel, and of course the all-important businesses that sell, manufacture, or distribute alcohol. All of them are exempt. The interesting language in the legislation itself, this is not language that has effect, but I think it's intended to express the intent of the drafters, is that the tax is not intended to be a tax on customers, that it is intended to be incorporated in the, quote, overhead of the business. Now, all of us who live in the real world understand that this is a ridiculous statement and that you can't impose a tax on a business without that tax being passed through to the ultimate customer. So I think it's more evidence of people's heads being in the sand with respect to how this is going to apply. The current draft of the legislation has it going into effect immediately. So assuming that the council can muster 7 votes for this or some other version of this, then its impact would be immediate, and the tax would be prorated for the year 2020. Now, as I said, there's an interesting use of the prior calendar year because we're seeing lots of businesses, sectors of the economy who are being hammered more than others. John, you mentioned some of them, but you can think about the hotels in town, the restaurants, entertainment, various small businesses, healthcare operations, senior housing, union contractors, all of who in 2019 would have surpassed the $7 million threshold for incidence of the tax, but who in 2020, in this day and age, are just hanging by their fingernails to try to stay alive. And so I think what this tax really represents for most businesses in town is piling on. I mean, I kind of look at it as a punishment in search of a crime, and that really, like most blunt instruments, the unintended effects are the ones that are going to be the most significant. The collateral damage that will be suffered by all of these businesses that are already suffering. And indeed, as I think Taylor will talk about, the small businesses that rely on the larger companies for their survival. So the second piece of legislation that's in front of the council is the authorization for what's called an interfund loan. So the City Hall often does this. They've got various buckets of money internally. You'd be surprised how many buckets of money. And in order to make sure that the tax that's being collected can be put to immediate use, the council proposal suggests loaning money from to the city's general fund, sort of in lieu of the current tax, from various other sources within the city, and these funds then would be paid back as the tax was collected going forward. $60 million coming out of the low-income housing fund, $50 million out of the housing incentive fund, $50 million out of the family education preschool levy, $50 million out of the Move Seattle levy. That's the streets and roads levy that was adopted a few years ago. $50 million from the Seattle Park District Fund and $50 million from the Library Levy Fund. The idea would be that these funds would get dumped into the general fund and that they would all be repaid by the end of 2021. Interesting legal question here. Many of these funds were created as a result of voter-approved levies. Housing, the family education, the Move Seattle, Seattle Park District, the Library Levy, and therefore there are funds collected from taxpayers here in the city, property owners, that are earmarked for certain purposes in accordance with the levy legislation and the votes that were taken. And so I think it's really open to question whether the city can dip its hand into these other jars and use funds even on an interim basis for a purpose for which they were not approved by the voters during the levy process. The final piece of legislation is the spending plan. So they collected the money, they've borrowed from themselves, and then how are they going to spend it? Well, $200 million would go to a series of sort of interim COVID-related assistance measures. $500 a month in direct cash assistance for 4 months to those most in need. Up to $100 million would be distributed to low-income households enrolled in city or state assistance programs. Another $100 million for low-income households economically impacted but not enrolled in various of these assistance programs. Then about 5% in the first year, 3% in the following years would pay for collection and administration of the tax. And then funds would go into repaying the interfund loans with interest, of course. Once the loans are paid back in 2021, then in future years, the available tax proceeds would be used 75% for developing and preserving permanently affordable housing for those experiencing homelessness in households with incomes between 0 and 100% of area median income. And then 25%, the other quarter, for Green New Deal strategies, including transitioning homes to electric heat and weatherizing existing residences. There's oversight boards, a new social housing board, 23-member board that will be stood up in order to make recommendations about use of the Affordable Social Housing Fund. And there's already city has a Green New Deal oversight board, which will look after, make recommendations about the other 25% of the funding. So those three pieces of legislation are what we're dealing with right now. You know, there's an old rubric called Maslow's hammer, and I think many of you have heard it. It's when the only tool you have is a hammer, that everything looks like a nail. I think we're seeing this hammer again. As I said, the impact of blunt instruments is often most keenly felt. The pain is most keenly felt by those who never intended to see the impact in the first place. So I'm going to stop there and hand it back over to you, John.
Thank you, Jack. And just you spoke about the spending plan, and maybe just to put a finer point on that, this is new spending that's being proposed. This isn't dollars to support any basic services. These are new expenditures by the city.
That's correct. Yeah. These would be, you know, for the first bucket of money, the first $400 to $500 million would be spent in the first year or so in response to COVID, and then going forward, there would be new expenditures for the social housing and the Green New Deal.
Great. I'm going to turn now to Tim Cease to speak a bit about the political landscape and also the coalition that has come together to oppose this measure and communicate with city leadership. Tim is a partner with CBE Strategic and has been engaged in this effort, and is going to share some perspective on the politics around this issue at City Hall.
Morning, John. Thank you. Good morning to everybody online with us this morning. So this is an interesting situation we have. As much as this may look like 2018 all over again, it's significantly different. And obviously, because we're all at home, we know the one significant difference is the COVID virus and the complete shutdown of our economy as a result of that. That's also produced some pretty significant problems for the city that were not present in 2018. 2018, we had a booming local economy, and today we have an economy that's basically shut down. It's also clear the city is going to be facing significant revenue problems of their own because of the economic shutdown. That means sales tax and B&O taxes basically stopped coming into the city for the last month, and it will be slow recovering. On April 22nd, Ben Noble, the city's budget director, will present the revenue forecast to the city council publicly. Word is that that deficit will be about $200 million out of a $1.1 billion budget. That's very significant, and it poses a big challenge for this mayor and the city council to balance the budget going into next year. They will be facing significant cuts to programs that they have created and grown over the last many years, and we'll be facing reductions. The other political change is COVID itself has created a sense that the council has to act. They have to do something. They have to respond to show their constituents that they are in charge and addressing the immediate problem. And so in large part, the politics behind this tax proposal now are a response to COVID, at least the public-facing side of that, by Sawant and Morales. The council right now is pretty divided on this question. Obviously, Sawant and Morales are very supportive. They introduced it. 3 other members have expressed some real concerns about it. That would be Councilmember Lewis, Councilmember Juarez, have both, and Councilmember Pedersen of all 3 expressed their concerns publicly about it. In the past, Councilmember Herbold has said that she prefers to see a new tax put before the voters. We don't know if she has changed that position now because of the COVID virus and the emergency situation. And then other council members have been fairly silent at this point about what their intents are towards it. Importantly, Councilmember Mosqueda is the chair of the Budget Committee, and this is where the ordinances have been sent. They will be heard for the first time on April 22nd, which is this coming Wednesday at 10 a.m. Another significant difference we're dealing with is obviously there is no in-person meetings by the City Council, and no one can go to City Hall. So the meeting will be broadcast on the Seattle channel, and also you can call in on the meeting call-in line at the City Council. We don't know yet how they're going to take public testimony. That is up in the air. I don't believe they have a plan for public testimony for this Wednesday. They're still developing some type of system and approach to taking public input. Even though there is an emergency declaration here that we're operating under, they still need to allow the public to participate in some way in this debate. The other meetings will be held on April 29th and on May 13th, again, both at 10 a.m. The plan is that they will hear this proposal on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday. And then the next Wednesday, I believe Councilmember Mosqueda is planning on proposing her own alternative. And we've heard quite clearly from her that she is working on a different proposal. It is a proposal that generates new revenue. We don't know what that source will be. I don't think she knows yet, but it is, according to her, under development. So we need to stand by and expect a new proposal coming soon. This is important for a couple of reasons. One, Sawant has chosen to implement her ordinance with an emergency clause, which requires 7 votes. Given the vote count today, I think that's highly unlikely she gets 7 for her proposal as it currently stands. And the reason she declares an emergency is she wants access to the money right away to distribute it, as Jack described to you. That's one of the main reasons for that emergency clause. The secondary impact of the emergency clause is that it's not subject to referendum if it does pass with those 7 votes. So we can't use the same approach we did back in 2018 to take it to the voters, which that threat had the council repeal it. Now, Mosqueda's approach will be different, and she may not try and pass it by emergency. She may just try and pass it the normal way with 5 votes. So again, we have to keep an eye on what's happening there. But what is clearly important right now is, and then I want to touch on the mayor's position right now. We haven't heard a lot from the mayor on this. She hasn't publicly really spoken to the tax proposal. What we have heard is that her budget director, Ben Noble, has expressed concerns to the council about the interfund borrowing. That is an unprecedented amount of interfund borrowing. That is not, interfund borrowing in of itself is not usual, but at that level, it is highly unusual. And then as Jack pointed out, borrowing from voter approved measures is something that may be legally questionable. So the mayor has not yet really spoken to this proposal. So what we are doing is the coalition has come together of many of the business associations here locally. A lot of small and large businesses are coming together, and we are planning a grassroots campaign. We are seeking signatures to a business letter, much like we did in 2018, where 300 businesses signed on to a letter in opposition to that head tax. We are circulating a letter that both opposes this tax and asks the council to focus on recovery, to do the things that business needs help with to put people back to work so that these businesses can start paying taxes again. And that's going to be the way to solve the city's budget problem. So that letter is circulating. I know John's going to talk to you about it here shortly about how you can sign on to it. Secondly, we're also communicating directly with the public through an email campaign using listservs we developed last year during the election cycle. We have about 35,000 email people we communicate with regularly. We'll be asking them to sign both an online petition, which is up, which John again will describe to you and how you can access it on change.org. It's No Jobs Tax Recovery Now and on change.org. And also we'll be asking people to send emails directly to council members. Even though they're at home, we need to communicate with them, and they need to hear from the public, not just the advocates for this tax. They need to hear from small businesses, medium businesses, and large businesses. This is the wrong time for such a proposal when we're just going to be looking at how to recover from an economic shutdown. And they need to get these emails and the online petition to see that there is opposition to this action at this time. So with that, John, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Tim. And we will speak a bit more to those tactics and ways we need you all to engage and to help and to speak up here in the next week. Before we do that, I want to turn to Taylor Wong, again, founding executive director of the Ethnic Business Coalition and owner of several small businesses in the Seattle area. Taylor, as I understand it, you would not have to pay the tax directly, but you've got a lot of concerns about how you'd be impacted. I'm going to ask you to talk about those concerns and also what you're hearing from other small businesses within the city of Seattle.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. Yes, so I would not be, as a small business owner, would not be directly impacted by this tax. But however, I think, this tax is an ill-conceived tax in terms of the timing, the tone deaf of the council. As Tim said, we should be concentrating on recovery for small businesses and the Seattle economy as a whole, and not having conversations or even at this moment to be planning a opposition, even working on this opposition at this moment, because we just, at this moment don't have the bandwidth to deal with this tax at the moment. So as a small business owner, like I said, I would not be affected by this tax, but we have always been, my coalition, myself, other colleagues, other small business owners that I have worked with in the past and have spoken to, have always been on the position that the economy and the business environment in Seattle, we work as an ecosystem. We are interdependent upon each other. And when taxation on large business has a ripple effect on small business. And I think we saw that ripple effect really early and quite impactful during the start of the COVID-19 in Seattle. You saw it where when the first stay-at-home recommendation came out, and a lot of large businesses recommended their staff to work from home, to telecommute, when restaurants were still able to keep their doors open, you saw the dropped, and we saw a drop in business immediately from the lack of traffic in downtown Seattle and in the Seattle areas.
We be clear on the timeline. You're talking about early March when folks
Yes.
were advised to work from home.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, through the last couple of months, we saw the cancellation in corporate events and caterings and functions across the city that have hurt our independent businesses, whether you are a retailer, you are a service, shop down in Seattle, whether you are a restaurant, the impact was immediate. So we are interlinked. The business community is interlinked, and any taxation on large business, on businesses that, you know, have a gross revenue of 7 million or more, will have an effect on small businesses. And right now, as small businesses are struggling to get back on their feet, to maintain their staff or keep their doors open, what we need right now from City Council and our leaders at Seattle is a recovery package. And I truly believe concentrating on recovery will provide the more long-term economic stability, not just for Seattle, for businesses, but for workers as well. And as we've seen with this tax, it doesn't provide any provisions for recovery for small business. It's provided recovery for workers, but these measures are very short-term stopgaps that I believe will help in the immediate future, but will not provide any stability for us as an economy going forward. And in order for us to recover long-term and be able to go forward as a community, we need to bring jobs back. We need, and in order to bring jobs back, we need to be stable as small businesses. In order for small business to be stable, we need support from our leaders, not a taxation on the business community that will have a ripple effect on us. And so for me, you know, opposing this tax is not just for supporting the business community as a whole, but I think it will have an effect on me and other colleagues as well. So other small businesses that I have spoken to have the same sentiment, have the same frustration with City Hall, that in this time, during this time, that instead of talking about recovery and what we can do to support small businesses, City Hall is now imposing another tax. A tax that we in the past, during 2018, when a lot of businesses were doing well, had already opposed, let alone during this time when we are all struggling to propose this at this time. So the sentiment from the small business community is that we do not need this tax at this moment. And, you know, a lot of us stand ready to support the business community, to oppose and to have conversations with City Hall and the mayor to look at alternative ways in which we can raise revenue for the city. And like Tim said, the best way to raise that revenue is make us whole, make us, you know, successful, give us tools and resources so that we can keep our businesses open and contribute to, you know, the tax dollar through our businesses.
So Taylor, you believe that other small businesses that wouldn't pay it directly but would be impacted share your your concern? Are they, I mean, there's so many of them are just fighting to survive and keep their doors open. Are they aware of this measure, and are you seeing them engage and plug in?
Well, like many of my colleagues, they're all facing challenges, financial challenges. But I think this is for the ones that we've spoken to and reached out to, they are definitely engaged and want to, share their thoughts and comments to City Hall that this is an ill-conceived, bad timing for the tax to be even proposed at this moment instead of talking about recovery. There's a number, as we all saw, there are a number of initiatives and financial support coming from the federal government or the city that have been proposed, but none of those federal financial support have even reached. A lot of it haven't been able to reach the small businesses. We've all applied for the SBA loans. We all applied for the Seattle stabilization funds, as well as some of the philanthropic funds available there. But to this day, I, as a business owner, have not received anything, and as well as a number of my other colleagues. So we are concentrated on making sure that we have access to that. And the city should be concentrating on making sure that those access is available for small business to help us recover, to help us keep our doors open, to rehire back the staff so that they have jobs, stability, and equality, rather than right now bringing this tax upon the community. And it's another fight and challenge that we have to fight at this moment, which, like I said, is ill-conceived and just literally tone deaf to the needs and challenges that small businesses are facing at the moment.
John, I'd like to pick up just one comment on what Taylor said, an interesting observation that I failed to mention before, and that is this $7 million threshold. I mean, what the ordinance would propose to do is exempt businesses with annual compensation packages less than $7 million. I'm not sure, I mean, others were smarter about this than me, but I'm not sure if that exemption is defensible. I don't know if the city really has the authority to draw that line. You know, all taxation in Washington has to be uniform in application, and the city's taxing in accordance with the authority that it gets from the state. We saw this in the income tax that was proposed and passed by the council right a couple of years ago, and it was, I mean, whatever one thought about the ability of the city to levy an income tax, I think it was beyond dispute, and the court decisions have reinforced this, that you can't have a progressive tax, right? The application of that income tax had to be uniform. And so we're in a position now in the income tax where, yeah, the city has some ability, it looks like. The Supreme Court did not take review of the case last month to impose a tax, but it can't be a progressive tax, right? It has to be the same tax on everybody in the city. And it's an interesting angle here is that I don't know that this, you know, what they're going to characterize as a small business exemption is really going to stand up. I'll just mention that in passing. It could be another one of the unintended consequences.
Yeah. And we have a number of small businesses with a gross revenue of 7 million, right? That does not necessarily translate to a huge net profit when you're talking about a restaurant that's operating at perhaps currently probably at a 3 to 5%, net revenue, net income. And so the 7 million will affect a number of small businesses, supposedly small. But if you're talking about gross revenue, like Jack said, it's going to include a lot of small businesses that will have unintended consequences for the city.
And Taylor, if you're working off a 3% margin, then a 1.3% tax is almost 50% of your profit.
Yep.
Jack, I was just pulling one question out of the Q&A box. Ask you again, maybe just to cover how this is intended to apply to folks in Seattle and what payroll the tax is intended to capture. If you could just highlight that one more time, because I think there's some
sure
the intent.
Sure, it's all compensation, So a business has to determine, fill out a tax return every year, and it's going to be all benefits and actual pay, bonuses, et cetera, that are paid out to employees. If that's and then in terms of figuring out what counts, it's compensation paid to anyone who lives in Seattle, regardless of where they work. Right. So that means if you live in Seattle but you actually work for a business in Carnation, then I don't know. I mean, is the city saying that the business in Carnation has to pay a tax to the city of Seattle? It's anyone who is principally who spends more than 50% of their work on Seattle matters or things in Seattle. So you could be working in a business in Bothell, selling office supplies, and if you had employees and more than 50% of their time was spent selling office supplies and you were a big enough operation, then I guess the Bothell business has to pay. Or someone who is principally assigned to Seattle. I'm not sure what that means. Very vague. So, I mean, in theory, you're working in San Francisco, and Seattle is part of the region that your business operates in, and Seattle is your market, right? You're a sales person assigned to Seattle, even though you live in San Francisco. I mean, does the California company have to pay the tax? I don't know. I mean, it's pretty ridiculous, I think.
So I want to turn now to live questions, and Emily will identify folks and unmute you, but if you can raise your virtual hand if you want to put a question to any one of our panelists, we want to allow time for that. So Emily, take it away.
Yeah, we have a question from Christy Smith. Christy, I am going to unmute you to ask your question. You also have to unmute yourself. Should have been clear.
I'm sorry, I don't have a question.
Oh, okay. Are there any others that want to ask a live question? There are a number in the Q&A box. If we need to go there for questions, we can. We have one from Jack Coe. Whoops.
Hi, are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I'm curious, Taylor's thoughts on the best strategy and the message to mobilize a lot of the small businesses that may not necessarily think that this tax impacts them, but they're definitely going to be affected by the ripple effect. And as you mentioned, there are a lot of businesses that are going to be impacted by that $7 million threshold that may not necessarily, in a drive-by sense to the average public, seem like they are quote unquote big business, but that are going to be subject to the $7 million threshold. What would you think is the best strategy to reach out to those folks as there is a grassroots effort being mobilized?
Thanks for the question, Jackie. I would say, first of all, the summary page that the DSA have put together in relation to this tax is very educational, very clear and concise. And so I think we're going to share some of that information out, right, John, later on. And I would highly recommend that you share this to your members or constituents and colleagues that you work with. It gives you a very clear and concise understanding of the bill. And secondly, I would start having conversations with them that, like I said, the effect of this is a ripple effect, as Jack pointed out, that it's not just including businesses located in Seattle. It's, for example, if you have a business located in Bellevue and you do 50% of your businesses in Seattle, let's say we're talking about, I'm using restaurants as an example, a food supplier that's located in Kent, and 50% of their deliveries or operations and business is being done in Seattle, they would be taxed on this. And as we all know, in the grocery and food business, suppliers, I don't think they are exempt from the grocery, but they would definitely go above the 7 million gross revenue threshold. And that would have, if they are taxed on this, it will have a ripple effect on the amount and the cost of our transportation and on the food costs that would go. And of course, then that would be passed on to our customers. So there is going to be a rising cost in supplies and cost of goods for restaurateurs, for retailers that are dependent on truckers or transportation that's coming in and out of the city. And I would point out that, you know, we are a ecosystem of interdependent businesses. And we saw that during the COVID-19, during this time where all the cancellations of events and cancellations of catering businesses from downtown companies and companies that are in and work around Seattle, of galas from nonprofits and so forth, had a direct impact on all of our businesses. So I would bring out, you know, examples. And Jackie, there are a number of small businesses already engaged in this process, and they can speak to the direct cost of what this would mean for them. And I would use that as examples and in letters that you are, you know, sending to your members. I think that in this, there has been a rising frustration, not just from large business, but I think the business community and small business as well, that, you know, our concerns and our challenges are not being heard from City Hall. And so I would also, you know, express to them that this is their opportunity to express that frustration by pressing back or opposing this bill that right now is the last thing that we need on our plate as small businesses.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Jack, there was a clarifying question in the Q&A box here around whether this applies to your payroll just above $7 million, or if you are subject to the tax and you pay a payroll of $7 million annually, then all of the payroll is subject to the 1.3% tax. Do you have an understanding of the intent there?
Jack, you're muted.
There we go. It's very clear. It applies once you pass that $7 million threshold for cumulative compensation in the calendar year, then the tax applies to all of the payroll, not just the portion above $7 million.
And just to clarify, it's a tax on payroll. Your gross revenues are not material to your.
That's correct. I mean, you could have, you know, gross revenues well in excess of 7 million or 20 million, but if your payroll is below 7 million, then the tax does not apply to you.
Emily, are there other virtual questions that?
Yeah, we have one from Janice Blair. Janice, go ahead. You have to unmute yourself.
Good morning. I'm wondering if this letter can be signed by residents as well as businesses. When will we get access to that letter, if that's possible? And will that letter be sent out to the residents' council and all condo concierge so that it can get a lot of residents to sign as well, since we're part of this?
Absolutely. We'll circulate the letter. There's a petition as well and additional information immediately after this webinar. And we encourage you to share each of those far and wide in your social networks with your colleagues, etc. The intent is to get as many signatures and individuals engaged, particularly before the scheduled council meeting on April 22nd. So look in your inbox following this webinar for that information.
I would just add a real easy for people to voice their opposition is you go to change.org and sign the online petition as well. For those that don't want to take the bother of a letter or email or something like that, numbers on that petition count as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Janice. We have one from Howard Cohen. Howard. You have to, there you go.
Hi there. I am enjoying listening to this. It's a lot of good knowledge here. Again, the threshold is 7 million in payroll, not revenue. But the question on the payroll is that based on individual businesses? So each individual business has their own business license, or does it fall under a parent company? So if a company owns multiple businesses, is it individual business 7 million or family umbrella 7 million?
Jack, do you have clarity on that? I don't.
Well, let's see. The definition, let me just look at the ordinance here. A business has the meaning as that term is defined in 5.30.020. So I'd have to go back and look at the code. I know compensation includes pass-through, payments, pass-through payments from a LLC or an S corporation. So if you're performing work and you're receiving pass-through payments from another entity that's coming up to you, and it's part of compensation, then that's going to be, all that will be accumulated, I think. It does not apply to investment income, return of capital, income from passive activities. So if you own an umbrella company and it has 4 different businesses, I think and no one of the businesses achieves the $7 million threshold, but taken together they do. I think there's a chance that accumulation could occur and that they would all get sucked into the trap. But I think we'll need to look a little more carefully at the definition in the Title V of the Municipal Code.
Emily, are there additional virtual questions?
Yeah, there's one from Maya Manis. Maya, go ahead.
Hi, I put it in the Q&A, but I'll just ask it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I just wanted to know what your thoughts are, because if it's not this payroll tax, how do we restructure our tax system to not have it where it's currently on low income residents paying the most share, which is about 17% of their income based off the sales tax, and how large businesses are paying like nominal percentages, sometimes, Amazon where it's 0%. So I just wanted to know, if not this payroll tax, what would your thoughts be to restructure our tax structure where it's not 17% of the income of low income people going to revenue?
Maya, was your question directed at anybody in particular? Or?
No, it's open to whoever is able to answer.
I would just share from the point of view of the Downtown Seattle Association, that's not necessarily what this conversation is really about at the city level, and there likely will be a conversation at the state level that continues about restructuring the state's tax system. When it comes to the city of Seattle and getting people back to work and getting our economy going, we don't see a payroll tax applied at the city level as being helpful to that, and we think it will be harmful. And in order to get the city revenues recovered, we need to get our economy recovered and get our small businesses open so they can hire people and get back to business and a healthy economy here in the city of Seattle.
I would just add to that, a lot of conversations are happening about the need to address the recovery and tax policy at the state level, as John said, not at the city level where we end up with more of a patchwork system. We need some uniform tax reform across the state, and we also need a strong strategy for economic recovery at the state level. We would be advocating for the city council and the mayor to join with the governor and the legislature and the county executive in that kind of effort to address these issues.
That was it.
So
for the
just to just to clarify, the reason why to not support this is because you would want to see something more on a statewide level rather than just, you know, City of Seattle doing its own thing.
Yeah, I can share that we have grave concerns over a payroll tax imposed in the worst economic conditions in the city of Seattle in 100 years, and the challenge that will pose to small businesses looking to get back on their feet and hire workers and to get our economy and our city revenues back. So absolutely. Emily, do we have an additional virtual question, or should we continue to take some out of the Q&A box?
That was it for the live questions. So I think turn to the Q&A box.
Okay. There's some questions generally, Jack, about the exemptions that are placed in here, and I'm not sure you're going to have the answer to this, of sort of the rationale for some of the exemptions around alcohol and the other companies and sectors called out specifically, but I'm not sure you're able to answer the intent there, but that is one of the questions we have in the Q&A box.
Yeah, so the some of the exemptions are the result of state or federal preemption. So specifically, insurance businesses, gas stations, liquor sales are all exempted or preempted under state law. And so the ordinance just recognizes that for those reasons, they can't be touched. The exemption for nonprofits applies to those businesses formerly recognized as exempt from federal income tax pursuant to the Internal Revenue Code 501, all the 501c, 501d, and 401a entities. So that, in effect, is a federal type of issue. The grocery exemption, I presume, is intended to try to minimize the regressive nature of the tax. I mean, I can't say specifically what the intent was, but I mean, this is called a tax on compensation, but really, I think it's a gross receipts tax, right? It's not any different from the D&O tax. It just happens to fall on businesses that cumulatively pay more than $7 million in compensation, but it's not structured as a tax on the compensation itself. It's a tax on the receipts of the business, regardless of whether the business makes money or not, right? Just like in the B&O example. And so I think the grocery exemption is intended to say this is a very low margin business, and people need to buy food. People of all income levels, and that really, that's the sum total of the exemptions. Other than, as I say, the $7 million threshold is an exemption. And I did, just following up on the earlier question about business, I did look at the definition of business here, and I will share it with you. It includes all activities engaged in with the object of gain, benefit, or advantage to the taxpayer or to another person or class directly or indirectly. So you tell me, but I think it's broad enough. You could drive several trucks through, and so I would assume if you've got an umbrella organization that owns multiple entities, that you're going to be a business.
There's a question here around the potential of further economic harm in Seattle and the impacts of reduced tax collection and the ability for the city to repay this interfund loan that's been proposed in order to make revenue available from this measure immediately. What do you see as the implications of that, Jack, and maybe Tim, from your experience as Deputy Mayor of the City of Seattle? This is a pretty unique proposal here in a tough economic time. What if those loans cannot be repaid and the city gets into further economic harm?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, what it puts at risk is the city's credit rating, which means the cost at which they have to borrow money on the open market for construction bonds or short-term loans in order for cash flow purposes. And the city is always out on the market borrowing money at any given time. So that's a big risk there. Also, I think as Jack pointed out earlier, there's a big legal question here about, first of all, borrowing from a voter-approved fund when that voter-approved measure actually said it was for a very specific purpose. But secondarily, if they don't pay it back, then they've really broken that legal promise to the voters about how that money was going to be used. It's like there's a high risk there of litigation around these actions by the city. You know, it's going to take a while for revenue to come back to the city. When you know, they have had basically no B&O tax and sales tax coming in now for 30 days. And as this economy ratchets up slowly, this is going to be not a switch, but a dial being turned up. Those revenues will build very, very gradually. So this is going to be a structural problem for some time for the city. And they need to be taking a hard look at their financial practices. Just one thing I'll add, this is a city council with one exception. None of them have ever had to make a budget cut. Lisa Bold, as a staff person, was involved during budgets where there were deficits that they had to make cuts. But 8 of them have never participated in a budget cut exercise, and neither has this mayor. So this is uncharted territory.
And from your, go ahead, Jack.
John, I would also say, if I could jump on that, you know, assuming there's enough legal questions about the constitutionality, legality of this tax, we'll see how it evolves. But I think there's a question about what does the city do? The city has to make a tactical decision. If the tax is adopted and it's challenged in court, which I assume it would be. I mean, the city's had some bad experience over the last several decades with adopting really ill-conceived revenue enhancement measures. I can think back the street utility tax, and you know, if you recall years ago, the city started charging individual homeowners for the cost of electricity for street lights. Oh my God. And those were challenged, and the city had to actually pay back the funds that it collected some years later. Same thing, you remember about the phone book, Mike O'Brien's phone book legislation. So I don't know that the city is going to, particularly in the environmental and rather the economic circumstance that Tim has highlighted, how it's going to be a gutsy move for the city to not only do the interfund loan, but actually go expend these dollars if there's a substantial risk that it may be illegal to do so. So I think the whole could be, you know, the whole risk profile there is going to be a very interesting one for them to evaluate.
So I think we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank Taylor, Tim, and Jack, and just cover real quickly a couple of follow-up items. We will be sending you a link to the petition, a community letter that will be sent to the mayor and council, and some additional information via email on how you can help and express your opposition to this measure directly to city leadership. We urge you to take action immediately. There will be a hearing, as we noted, next week on this legislation. Folks who support this are making their voices known. If you oppose this, you must do the same, and we urge you to do that quickly and to share this information out with your networks on social media, on LinkedIn, with your colleagues. Next week, we invite you to join us on Thursday morning at 9 a.m. For our next virtual access event focused on the private and nonprofit sector's response. We'll have Tony Mestris, CEO of the Seattle Foundation, Heather Redmond with Flying Fish Ventures, and Alice Shobe, Director of Community for Amazon, talking about their collective efforts to support small business and community-based nonprofits and workers in this really challenging time. We hope you'll join us at 9 a.m. next Thursday for that access event. Look in your inbox for an invitation to that in the coming days. With that, I hope you enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Have a great rest of your week. Thank you for joining us for this access event focused on the jobs tax. Take care.
Thank you.